Hey guys, thank you so much for taking the time to watch the Fire Emblem panel from Comic-Con. I really appreciate everyone that managed to show up for this panel, and if you didn't get a chance to watch it in person, then I greatly appreciate you taking the time to watch it here on YouTube. However, I wanted to clarify some things before the video begins properly. So, we had a bit of an issue when it came to recording the panel live in the room. As you can see here, the angle that it's shot at, unfortunately we were trying to get the slideshow and the stage in the same shot, and unfortunately that didn't really work out too well, so I'm kind of pushed to the background here. Not to mention there's a glare over the projector, so we couldn't get the slideshow in very well either, and Jamie, my wonderful friend who is recording this, had no idea until after the panel was over. But we did have some pretty significant setbacks, including the video goes in and out of focus quite a bit throughout. So if you guys will forgive those shortcomings, please enjoy the panel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next panel.
Famicom Wars series. It's a strategy game where you have different units and different classes and things like that. And you also have this really successful series called Dragon Quest. So what if you were to take these two concepts and try to put them together? And that's how Fire Emblem was essentially created, is what if we were to actually take those units from Famicom Wars and give them a personality and a backstory? So that's essentially where that core concept came from. So the first game we have is Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and Warriors of Light. It was released in 1990. And this game introduced a lot of the core fundamentals of the series, such as permanent death. So if you lost a character in this game, you lost that character. They were gone forever. There was nothing you could do to get them back, except for one item you could get towards the end of the game that you could resurrect one character with. And that item was removed from future entries in the series. Next slide. Okay. So in 1992, we finally got the second Fire Emblem game called Fire Emblem Gaiden that was again released on the Famicom in Japan. And the thing about Gaiden is, I'm sure you guys know that a lot of the original big NES franchises like Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, and Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest didn't go over so well because they tried to deviate from their original material so much. This was also the case with Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem had the same problem. So Fire Emblem Gaiden was a very, very different game from the original. You did not have, breakable weapons or anything like that. How come a archer can attack from one space away against a melee unit? What's up with that? And you also had random encounters and different types of enemies you could actually fight instead of just normal humans. So, but Gaiden was actually criticized for those changes because it deviated so much from the original source material. If only it was given a remake. More on that later. But Gaiden also had two branching paths where you played as two Lord protagonists. So you had, Alm and Celica, the two branching paths, and they would eventually meet up later in the game. But honestly, one of the really crazy things about Gaiden was the introduction of being able to class change into different types of classes with the villager class we all know and love. But unfortunately, the Langrisser series had already thought of that first. And by 1992, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were already on their fifth entry. So this series was kind of behind the times a little bit and still lingering in the NES era. You're going to see that as a reoccurring theme, where each entry in the series was kind of a little bit late to the game for its respective console. So finally, we have the third game in the series in, 1994? Yeah, so this is Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, and now you realize the title of this panel is a pun. And you're probably cringing at that just like I am. But, so Mystery of the Emblem was the first Super Famicom game, and it features our lovely Lord Marth, the legendary hero, and he decided to wear pants this time. Apparently he didn't believe in wearing pants in the original game. So Mystery of the Emblem is also a pseudo-remake of the original game. It has two separate parts of the story, Book 1 and Book 2, similar to how, if you've ever played the Ys series, Ys Books 1 and 2 are usually packaged together. The same thing for Mystery of the Emblem. So the first part is a straight remake of Shadow Dragon, of the original game. And the second part, with a couple characters and features taken out, mind you, and the second part is a continuation of that story. So it's the first true Fire Emblem sequel we ever got. And you guys could win a physical copy of this today. Next slide. All right. So, pop quiz. What was the first game in the series to feature the weapon triangle? Anyone want to raise their hand? Go ahead. Correct. Genealogy of the Holy War. What was the first game in the series to introduce the dating mechanic, where you could actually pair up your support conversations, get your characters married, and have children with them? Go ahead. Correct. So Fire Emblem 4, or Genealogy of the Holy War, is widely considered amongst some of the hardcore fans to be one of the best entries in the series. This game pioneered a lot of the features that we know and love in some of the newer games like Awakening, such as the weapon triangle, which became a staple of the series, as well as the ability to, through the support conversations that your characters would have, you could get them married and have children, and you would continue the second part of the story while playing as the children of the characters from the first route. And if you didn't manage to marry those characters together and have their children characters, you would still get substitute characters that you would get to continue the game with. So you weren't completely lost if you lost those characters. This game has a very controversial story with a lot of very heavy themes. And, we all know about the controversy that was Fates' localization. This game would have never been localized with the story the way it was. So maybe we'll get a remake of this soon. I really hope this game is the next game in the series that's on the chopping block for a remake. But they're going to have to censor a couple of things to make it kind of acceptable. Because there's things like, marrying your family member off to another kingdom and like incest and things like that that are just not okay. But again, this game is one of the most well-received games in the series by the fans. You played as the Lord Sigurd, and then you would later go on to play as his son in the second part of the game. And this game featured very large-scale battles that we actually still don't see in the Fire Emblem games to this day. There's never been a game that has really matched the scale and the size of the types of battles you see in the Genealogy of the Holy War. And the enemies would actually use things like formations. Like you would have enemies that would form a wall or like a pipe formation in front of you to try to block your path. We don't really see that much anymore. So hopefully if we get a remake of Genealogy, we'll bring some of those features back into the mainstream series. Next slide. All right. So now we move on we're getting towards the end of the Super Famicom era. We're getting over towards like the N64 era. So this game, Fire Emblem Thracia 776, was released all the way in 1999 on the Super Famicom. We did not get a Fire Emblem 64. But this game also introduced a lot of really interesting new features and is also widely regarded by the hardcore fans. It introduced the alternate win conditions. So in Fire Emblem games, you don't always have to just kill all the enemies to progress to the next map. You essentially have to, you can capture the enemy base, you can kill a boss, you can do a defend chapter. Those alternate win conditions were introduced in Thracia. But Thracia, because of when it came out and how limited it was printed, it remains the poorest selling Fire Emblem game in the series, only a couple 100,000 copies. And it, of course, was never released outside of Japan. So this game is pretty hard to find and remains to be the one of only 2 games in the series that I do not own. But it is, again, widely regarded by the fans, and if you guys want to try it on an emulator, or if you do get a physical copy and you have that Retron 3 or 5 like I talked about, definitely give it a shot. Okay, so a couple of things happened between the release of Thracia and the next Fire Emblem game. So first of all, we did not get a Fire Emblem 64, but we believe that elements and aspects of Fire Emblem 64 were repurposed and reused in other games. Shozo Kaga, the original director of the Fire Emblem series, left and tried to form his own company and make his own series, which we'll be talking about next. But there's a Fire Emblem anime. Who knew that? So this picture is actually a photograph of a VHS box of this series, just so I could prove that it exists. And I have not seen this in its entirety, but it does have an English dub. This was the first Fire Emblem property that was ever localized. And it's not good. but Mars. It basically is the straight story of Shadow Dragon. So you have Marth, who in this game in this anime, not only does he decide to wear pants, but he also goes by the name Mars, which was like the translated name for Marth during that era. So this was technically the first Fire Emblem property to be localized, and I'm sure nobody remembers this. Although I'm pretty sure, even though how bad it is, if I saw a VHS copy of this, I would probably buy it. And maybe we'll show some clips of that later, who knows. All right, next slide. So I mentioned that Shozo Kaga left Intelligent Systems, the company that develops the Fire Emblem series, in favor of making his own studio and releasing his own game. So he wanted to make a game he wanted to just make Fire Emblem, but he didn't want to make it with Nintendo for whatever reason. I'm not sure what the whole story is behind that. But he wanted to make Fire Emblem, but he wanted to make it his own way. So he wanted to make a game called Emblem Saga for the PlayStation, and Nintendo was like, hey, that kind of sounds a little bit like Fire Emblem, you might want to change that name a little bit. So he did. So this is Tear Ring Saga. It was released for the PlayStation, and there's also a sequel to this. I think it's Burret Saga, something like that. Yeah, and so these games they're very much a Fire Emblem game through and through. The gameplay mechanics are exactly the same. The art style is painfully similar if you look at this cover, and this game uses the same like Castlevania Symphony of the Night style 2D character sprites, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So if you're a really hardcore Fire Emblem fan and you're digging like more of that classic Fire Emblem experience, definitely check out this game. The only thing is, again, the PS1 is not region free, so you'd have to have a Japanese PS1 to play it. But I highly recommend checking it out. Okay, so in 2001, a little game came out called Super Smash Bros. Melee.
Roy's our boy.
Roy's our boy. Who's here plays as Roy in Super Smash Bros. Melee? Like everybody, right? So Super Smash Bros. Melee was going to introduce Fire Emblem characters to the West. We were supposed to get Marth, who is the most iconic character in the series, of course, and then we were also supposed to get Sigurd from Genealogy of the Holy War. However, they decided instead of Sigurd, we're going to go with a Lord from an unreleased game. So they put in Roy, and Roy's game had not even been released yet. So Roy appeared in Super Smash Bros. Melee before this game, Fire Emblem: The Binding Blade, had ever been released. So this is the first game in the series to ever feature a tutorial, because there had been such a gap in the release years and things like that. This came out in 2002 on the Game Boy Advance, and supposedly, we suspect, used recycled assets from what we thought was going to be Fire Emblem 64. We don't know that for a fact, but this game was criticized a little bit by the fans for being essentially like a cookie-cutter copy and paste story of Shadow Dragon, because it hits essentially all the same key points. You have the same types of characters, but little did they know this was part of a larger story. So again, this game is kind of hard to find. I've actually seen some people that will sell repro carts of this in English. So if you're ever interested in playing this game, it is accessible out there. I am thoroughly against pirating and buying like illegal repro carts and things like that, but it is out there. And we unfortunately didn't have like the second part of this story arc that we're talking about. Next slide. Okay, so who here has played my second favorite game in the series, Fire Emblem Blazing Sword? All right, that's what I want to see. I love this game to pieces. So what you're going to see on this picture as well is the title's in English. That's not a mistake. This game was released in English. This is the first Fire Emblem game in the series to be localized, and it's the prequel to Binding Blade. So you play as Roy's father, Eliwood, and the other two Lord characters. This is the first time we had three Lord characters that played side by side simultaneously and all occupied different classes. Eliwood was your traditional Lord who had rapiers and things like that, and Lyn was a Myrmidon class who used katanas and things like that, and then Hector used axes, which I certainly appreciate, being an axe user myself. This game has a really beautiful story and beautiful music, beautiful characters. Everything about this game is fantastic. This is the first game in the series to feature an easy type mode. And also, they changed some of the early chapters in this game for the American release. the first 6 chapters of this game is what they consider to be Lynn's route, but it's actually just a tutorial for the game because this was the first game to be localized in English. But later on in the game, you get a choice to pick either Eliwood's route or Hector's route, and by doing so, you would continue their story. And there's a couple of optional chapters that only appear in one route or the other. And I think if you pick Hector's route, it ends up being close to like 33 chapters long, like really long. Especially when you consider like Awakening, for instance, was 25 chapters. Yeah, 33 chapters. So pretty impressive. And if you understand like the entire story, like what happens in Binding Blade, there's parts in this game that will mess you up. Like and those of you that have played it know what I'm talking about. Like when you have to rescue Prince Zephiel, and then you realize the implications of what you've done and how that's going to impact the story in the future. You're just like, oh, this I don't feel so good about this. But anyway, if you have not had the opportunity to play The Blazing Sword, definitely look for a copy. It's kind of hard to find now, but you can probably find a loose copy without the box for like maybe $35, $40 probably. All right, next slide. Okay, so in 2004, I'm sorry, we had another Fire Emblem game announced. So what a time it must have been to be a Fire Emblem fan, especially if you were in America where the games were finally getting localized. So not only did you just come off of one of the best games in the series, but you had 2 Fire Emblem games announced within the same year. So the first game that was announced was Fire Emblem Path of Radiance for the GameCube. But then all of a sudden we had this announcement for another Game Boy Advance game, which is the entry we're looking at right now, Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. And Sacred Stones, even though it was announced after Path of Radiance, was released first. So Sacred Stones uses the exact same engine and character sprite animations from Blazing Sword. However, it's actually a throwback to Gaiden. You have your 2 lords with your 2 branching paths. You have a world map which you can actually move around in and run into random encounters. And you have the Gaiden chapters, which are essentially, going through a dungeon, fighting giant spiders and stuff like that. Oh. So Sacred Stones is also one of the most beloved games in the series, even though I have not personally finished it. I will do that one of these days. Sacred Stones, again, it's kind of controversial because it has that same exact formula from Blazing Sword, but it's a little bit more in depth. It has that throwback to Gaiden that makes it more content, more rich of an experience. Next slide. All right, so who here has played Fire Emblem Path of Radiance?
We like
All right.
We like ice.
We do. So Path of Radiance was the first game to go into 3D, and so it was released on the GameCube in 2004. And this was going to be part of, again, a larger story, just like how we had with Binding Blade and Blazing Sword. So Path of Radiance, for those of you that haven't played it, unfortunately, it's very hard to get a copy of it. A copy of this complete runs about $120 secondhand now. So if you have your copy of it, make sure you hold on to it, because it's quite rare now. But Path of Radiance is definitely a fantastic game. Ike is not your typical Lord at all. He is a very different character from the other Lords in the series, and he has a great arc over the 2 games. It's very similar to me, almost like a more vanilla, less gory and graphic version of like Guts from Berserk, because he starts out as just like this guy that's kind of fighting for his beliefs and for his life, and he turns into this badass mercenary who is like super buff, and I got ripped in 30 days for fighting for my friends. And but I definitely recommend checking out this game. Again, the arc that the characters go through is really, really impactful when you get to the end of the second game in the series. All right, next slide. All right, who here has played my favorite game in the series, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn? All right, so now you guys know who I'm cosplaying and why I'm cosplaying him. So this game is definitely an emotional experience, especially if you have played Path of Radiance and you see just, like I said, that arc those characters go through and how they've changed over the 3 years or whatever the time skip was. Like I said, Ike is like super buff and swinging this big sword, and I can't even begin to tell you how excited I was when I first got to the first chapter with the Grail Mercenaries, and you see them just sweep in and clean house, and I'm just like, I'm so happy right now. But yeah, Radiant Dawn is not only the sequel to Path of Radiance, but it also introduces a new arc with new characters called the Dawn Brigade. So that's where we get some different characters, as you see there on the cover. And this was kind of a controversial thing for some people that played it, because you start out with the Dawn Brigade, Micaiah, Soth, those characters, and they stay, as baseline characters. Then you play as the Grail Mercenaries and the other characters, and they're all like pre-promotes who are super strong, and you can carry over your data from Path of Radiance and have like these just really powerful characters. And then you go back to the Dawn Brigade, and they're really weak, and it's kind of infuriating. And the game actually gives you a notification that says, from here on out, these characters are going to die. So make sure you focus on the ones you want to keep alive, because the most important thing is by the last arc of the game, you've kept the characters you want to keep alive. And I thought that was actually really cool they mentioned that. But Radiant Dawn also has an easy type mode. And I actually greatly appreciate this feature. This is when I start to become a little critical of the series, if I can be honest. So, as much as I appreciate the challenge of the Fire Emblem games, there are features such as random stat growth when you get a level up, where you may get you may get a +1 in 4 different stats, or you might get a +1 in luck. So, Radiant Dawn with easy type mode, you can definitely tell, in addition to the reduction in the density of enemy encounters, they also give you, in general, better level up RNG. So if you level up a character, you're going to get a +1 in 2 or 3 different stats, as opposed to like the 1 that you could get on a bad level up. And there are parts in Blazing Sword where I would get a poor level up for Eliwood, let's say, and just hard reset the game. Like, all right, runs over, starting over from the beginning, because that stuff can potentially cripple later chapters if you're actually going to be able to defeat a certain character or not. So having the easy type mode actually really does make it more accessible to more players, and it does kind of remedy those, if I dare say, poor design decisions like that. Okay? So in 2010, we got a DS entry in the series, and this game is, and maybe that title looks a little familiar to you, this is a straight remake of the original game. So if you've never played, who here has played Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon? Okay, well congratulations, you've played the original game in the series. So this is a straight remake of the original Famicom game, and he goes back to playing as our legendary hero Marth again, except this time not only did he decide to wear pants, he decided to wear armor as well. So he's getting up there in the world, as you can see. I'm not a big fan of this game, I'll be perfectly honest. To me, and the thing that rubs me the wrong way about it the most is the art. I think the sprites are just ugly. And especially when you compare it to the previous games in the series. And going from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn, Path of Radiance has some ugly portraits as well, but Radiant Dawn is like, great. All right. So we're going to watch another video really quick.
I love videos. Me too. Like, it's fun. It's just like, am I into this?
So who here has played Fire Emblem Awakening? Everybody, right? All right.
Except this guy.
That's the answer I wanted to hear. So Fire Emblem Awakening was released for the 3DS in 2013, as we all know. And this is where we kind of have to address the elephant in the room. Because this is probably the game that introduced a lot of you to the series. Myself included, to be perfectly honest. The first game I played was Awakening, and it is my third favorite game in the series. So there's a couple of, next slide, and we'll go back to that one in a second. So the controversy regarding Awakening. So I'm sure you guys have had discussions with people in the Fire Emblem community that dislike Awakening, or they want to battle these arguments about, like, you know, people will say, oh, Awakening saved the series and things like that. So here's some of the discussion about that. Here's some of the facts about that. So Awakening is the best-selling game of the series, obviously. And when you compare it to the other games that were available on the 3DS at that time, it's not hard to see why. But it's an objectively good game. And so I'll kind of talk about the reason why there was this big disparity in the fan base between the modern fans and the classic fans. So go back to the previous slide really quick. So before this game was released, we had another Fire Emblem game that was released in Japan. And it was a remake of Mystery of the Emblem. We did not get this game over here. This is New Mystery of the Emblem, Heroes of Light and Shadow. This was the first game in the series to introduce the option to play without permanent death. So now we got Awakening over here in the States. This game also had the feature to play without permanent death, which if you've never played a game in the series before, like I did at the time, you probably wanted to play without permanent death. And what that does is now there's this renaissance of Fire Emblem where all these new people are getting into it. It makes the older games that don't have this feature less accessible retroactively. And that makes some of the classic fans feel alienated as a fan base. So that's where a lot of that controversy started, but I'm here to tell you that's all nonsense. The classic games are great, the new games are great, I love all of them. Like I said, Radiant Dawn is my favorite, but Awakening is my third favorite game in the series. So I have no hate or animosity towards any of the games in the series, and I feel like you guys should have that same mentality as well. Especially if you interact or talk to any of the Fire Emblem fans now or cosplayers, you can definitely see that mentality starting to come to fruition. So, great game. I feel like as a JRPG, its story is kind of generic, but that's okay, especially as a jumping on point for the series. I would always recommend it as the first entry you should play, especially if you don't have access to Blazing Sword. All right, next slide. Okay, so obviously, who here's played Fire Emblem Fates? Majority of you as well, right? So this game is definitely very controversial as well. As I said, there was a lot of controversy regarding the decision to localize it and some of the decisions they made regarding that. And then the fact that they split the game into 3 routes plus DLC. So if you didn't get the collector's edition, you were shelling out, unfortunately, a lot of money to be able to play every route and play the full, complete experience of Fates. So you either played one game that might have been okay, but maybe a little bit lackluster, or you play the entire experience and then you kind of see how the plot all comes together and, you know, take it or leave it. It has a couple of flaws. So I don't agree with the fact that you need to buy additional DLC to see the true ending. I think that's kind of ridiculous. But that being said, I did enjoy Fates. I have a lot of very fond memories with it. And if you haven't taken the time to listen to the music, like Staying Alone, this game has a gorgeous soundtrack. Like, I actually bought the 8 CD collection for this game's soundtrack. And if you've never taken the time to listen to it before, just look for the track Road Taken. It's fantastic. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to kind of skim through these most recent entries because it's probably what you're most familiar with already. So next slide. So in 2017, we had this explosion of Fire Emblem with the Fire Emblem Direct we got, where they announced 3 new properties would be releasing in the same year. The first of which being Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadows of Valentia, which is a remake of Gaiden. So remember, I said Gaiden had all those great features that were first implemented, like the branching paths and no weapon breaking, all those proper RPG mechanics that make it feel not quite like a Fire Emblem game. Now we actually have the technology to facilitate that. So Echoes is a fantastic game if you haven't played it. It's going to feel very different from the other games in the series, but I think it has as much of a rightful place beside them as any other game. Next slide. All right, here we go. So, Fire Emblem Heroes. Who here plays Fire Emblem Heroes? Okay. So, Fire Emblem Heroes is a free-to-play mobile phone game with microtransactions. And that statement alone pretty much sums up how I feel about it. It has done a lot of great things. It has good assets. It has good art, sometimes. Not every character looks good. And it has introduced a lot of the casual players. They can just download a free phone game and have access to characters like, Lynn from Blazing Sword without having to pay $40 for a copy of Blazing Sword. So it's done a lot of great things for the community and for the fandom. And it's a well-made phone game. The game mechanics at their core are Fire Emblem. But it's still a free-to-play mobile phone game with microtransactions. So for that reason, I don't really play it. I haven't even downloaded the latest update, frankly. And you'll find that I'm kind of thoroughly against these types of games in general. But I don't have any hate or animosity towards Heroes, especially because it's boosted the community so much and gotten so many new people into the series. All right, next entry. So I was having a conversation with a friend of mine because he knows I'm a big Muso fan at the beginning of 2016 before we had this, or 2017 before we had this announcement. And we were playing the Muso game, and he said, if you could pick one franchise that you would love to see a Muso game based off of, what would it be? And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, you know what? Fire Emblem. And shortly after that, we got that announcement. And I was so hyped. Let me tell you, I was so ready for this game more than like any other game in 2017, really. And this game had a ton of controversy about its release, mainly having to do with the roster. Because again, whether you were a new fan or a classic fan, you felt like the character you wanted to see in the game was not being represented. And I agree with that. There's a lot of characters that I wanted to see that I didn't get a chance to. But that being said, from a design standpoint, the characters they included make perfect sense. And I had some concerns with it as a game in terms of quality. I had some other concerns about the way the combat flowed and the way the animations looked. I was like, I don't know about this. But I finally got my hands on it. I recently completed it on the 3DS version, and I have to say, it is a good Muso game. It's not a good Fire Emblem game, but I would highly recommend playing it, especially if you're more of a modern fan than a classic fan, because there's definitely more representation there, which is not a bad thing. But there are some features in this game that should be staples of the genre from here on out, such as the ability to command other AI-controlled units around the map to go conquer certain forts and things like that. And the ability to pair up and have a unit with high mobility ferry a character with low mobility to a combat zone, and then you can just swap and fight as that character that doesn't have a weakness because they're not a flyer. So definitely check out Fire Emblem Warriors if you are a fan of Muso games, but I feel like it really only works if you're a fan of both Fire Emblem and Muso games. If you're not a fan of both, you may be disappointed. All right. I believe that is it. So it's question time. So if you have a question, I will say go ahead and line up in front of our lovely saint up here, and we'll ask them one at a time. And then, all right, give us 1 second. We're going to actually kind of document your questions here as we go, so that we can keep track for the sake of the prize. So what I'm going to ask you to do is say your name. And that way we can keep track of who asked what question. So say, hi, my name is this, and this is my question, and we'll decide at the end if you get a prize or not.
Is it our cosplay name or our real name?
Your real name, yeah. All right. All right, go ahead.
Hello? Okay. Hey, I'm Emily, and I was just wanting to know, I know Warriors seems to have a lot of the different characters together, but are all of the worlds separate, or are the worlds in any way connected to each other?
So in Warriors, who here has played Dragon Quest Heroes? Anybody played that? A couple people. Good man, good man. So Dragon Quest Heroes and Fire Emblem Warriors have literally the exact same plot. It is the exact same story. So basically what it is you have a new world that has never been seen before in a Fire Emblem game that the two main characters occupy, and the other characters from the other games in the series drop into that world through like dimensional portals and things like that, because there's like an unbalance in that world. So the worlds are all separate, and the characters that come into Warriors are essentially, they haven't like played out their story to its conclusion yet. So when Robin meets Crom and things like that. They haven't had the story of Awakening fully played out, so they don't have those plot revelations about each other established yet. They're just kind of unfamiliar with each other. But does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, I was just wondering, like, is Shadow of Vesperia somehow connected to Fates or Awakening or anything like that? Or are they all just completely separate?
Oh, okay. So the only confirmation I have as far as that goes is we pretty much know that Awakening takes place in the same world as Shadow Dragon. And Warriors definitely confirms that with a couple things. Crom and other characters know who Marth is. They're like, oh my god, it's a legendary hero Marth. I'm your biggest fan. Can I have your autograph? And the other one is there's a character who appears in both Shadow Dragon and in Awakening. Do you know which character that is? Anybody want to guess? Tiki, very good. So yeah, that's the only confirmation we have. As far as we know, the other Fire Emblem games are in completely separate universes from each other. But that was one of the first questions I had when I played Awakening is, where does this fit in with the timeline? Because I almost wish that every Fire Emblem game existed in the same world, but like hundreds of years apart from each other. That's what I would have liked to have seen. Thank you so much for your question.
Hello, my name is Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
I would like to know, out of the entire Fire Emblem cast, are there any confirmed characters to be gay?
Are there any confirmed characters to be gay? At least Niles, because
Niles and Raja from Jinx, she's bisexual.
at least them. Beyond that, I'm sure you could speculate, but confirmed, we definitely know it's the ones that you can have a same-sex relationship with in Fates, which is Niles and Rajat, or however you pronounce her name. They're considered bi. Because they can marry a female, or they can marry the opposite sex or the same sex, and I guess that would count for Corrin as well. Corrin would technically be bi as well. But yeah, that's the only thing we have confirmed. The rest is just speculation.
I'm very satisfied.
Thank you, man.
All right, my name's Garrett.
Hey, Garrett.
Got a strategy question.
Okay.
In Fates and Awakening, you can pair up units.
Uh-huh.
I always found myself pairing up units that were identical. I would pair up an archer with an archer, so when the first archer gets damaged, I just swap, and that way I still have an archer in that position.
Mm-hmm.
Would you recommend still doing that, or pairing up an archer with something more tanky?
Well, it ultimately depends on your support levels, first of all, what kind of bonuses they give each other. I like what you're suggesting, but I feel like that because that second archer can't do depending on the battle you're engaging in, they can't always do an attack from that position. So it would be pretty redundant to have two archers side by side. So I would think it'd be better to either put them with somebody who can benefit from an enhanced mobility or somebody who's a little bit tankier. So for instance, but it ultimately depends on your support conversations, right? Because you're going to pair up the ones that have the highest support. So if you're, depending on what your ships are going to be, those are the characters you're going to pair up. Because like for Awakening, I had Stahl and Hanne, the shapeshifter girl, the beast type, and she didn't really benefit him in combat in any way, but because they had an S rank support, she would just take hits for him all the time. So, but yeah, I agree with what you're saying, but I would definitely pick a character that increases mobility, and then a character that has maybe a range attack. So maybe a cavalier and a mage, or a cavalier and a archer. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Sarah.
Hey, Sarah.
I like your heart.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, basically, my boyfriend was a demo tester for Sacred Stone, so he's been in the game.
Really?
Yeah, he got the game and he was one of the first people to try it out.
That is so cool.
So we've been trying to genealogy map the Fates games,
Mm-hmm.
and I think when you said Connection World earlier, actually one of the Awakening worlds, the one that starts with a V or something, that's actually connected to Gaiden.
Okay. Well, actually, that's an interesting call out because of the children characters in Awakening appearing in Fates, you could also say that those two worlds are connected as well. And so I did not address that. So it looks like you stumped me on that one. But so you're saying that the Fates world is related to a different Fire Emblem world, essentially?
I was saying Awakening was tied to Gaiden.
Oh, okay, interesting. Okay.
The kingdoms match up.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Also, my question is, since I'm mapping genealogies,
Mhm.
how incestuous would a relationship between Corin and Azura would be? Because I think you're at least her cousin.
Yeah, you are definitely her cousin. Sorry if you really like Missouri.
It could be technically she could be your sister,
Mhm.
but that's depending.
Yeah, and I think
Incest is incest.
it's weird because again in Japan they don't feel as strongly about those types of things. So they don't if they were to canonically say, yeah, you marry your cousin or you marry your half sister or something like that, that is, it's controversial, but it's still like kind of commonplace in their fiction. So it's not something that they would not write into the game. Now over here we'd be like, whoa, no way, we can't have that. So yeah, I feel like you're on point there that it is she is related to you, and that would be an incestuous relationship, but it's not something that they would not write into the game.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to going through all the support conversations. I'm trying to get a lineage for the royal families.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, I'm Steve.
Hey, Steve.
So my question is about sacred stones. And
Uh-huh.
A lot of the Fire Emblem games, we kind of see this duality, like Sealing Sword and Blazing Sword, Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, that like each of them kind of carries over. Even Awakening in the Fates, you got like Ego and those three carrying over. But Sacred Stones is the only one that is like by itself. Was there any reason for that?
Not as far as I know. Because the development process of Sacred Stones was so weird, being that it was announced, they literally tried to shoehorn it in before Path of Radiance's release. So I feel like maybe there was potential there to make another part of that, but like they didn't even make new assets for it. It was literally the same sprites from Blazing Sword, minus like the special animations and stuff like that, and like the weird enemies like the giant spiders. But other than that, yeah, there was. As far as I know, there was no intent to make another game in that same style or to continue that pair. But that's a fantastic question, only because, to your point, the other games in the series surrounding it had that identity. So, because even I forgot to mention this, but Genealogy and Thracia are continuations of each other too.
Even Gaiden is just a continent away from 1 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, so that's really cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Clay. First, I've got a little fun fact, and then I've got a question.
All right, we're going to cut it off after the gentleman behind you. Sorry, guys. But we're running out of time, so go ahead.
Did you know that Radiant Dawn actually had a translation error, and that there's an easy, a normal, and a hard, but it counts as normal, hard, and then very hard?
So in the English version, if you pick easy, you're actually picking normal?
Yes.
Okay. So I remember hearing that now that you're mentioning it, and it's almost like this thing where I'm like, okay, well, I've played it, so I guess I thought I was playing on easy, and I was actually playing on normal the whole time.
Yes, you are. Also, how terrified were you when you're the Dawn Brigade and the Grail mercenaries come up to your doorstep and you're like, whoa, I gotta fight these guys.
I'm actually replaying it right now, and I'm right about at that chapter. I just had to fight the Lagoos as the Dawn Brigade, and I'm like, oh, this is bad. And then the Black Knight showed up, and everything was okay.
Yeah, and then if you port it over from like Path of Radiance, you're like, they're even more beastly.
Yeah, it's crazy. Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Stephen.
Hey, Steven.
I just first would like to make a comment that in Radiant Dawn, toward the end, it says end game part one end game.
Mm-hmm.
I raged really hard at that. I thought that was the end of the game, and I was really mad, and I realized the game goes on.
Yeah.
Especially if they just revealed the Black Knight stuff. Anyhow, my question is more toward you and your play style in Radiant Dawn, and pertaining to the last man's question. Do you intentionally not level Ike coming to that fight where you have to defend the castle with the Dawn Brigade? And Ike is so terrifyingly difficult.
I never really thought that through to that level, so I probably leveled him because I was like, yeah, get him, man, cut him down. I never thought about like purposely under-leveling him for that, but that's a great point.
I intentionally dodge battles with him until after that fight happens, until after the Dawn Brigade scene, and then I'll level him to max as quick as possible. But
Right, you can do that with bonus XP, so that's good thinking on your part.
Right.
Yeah, I never thought about that. That's a great point.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys so much for your questions. We're going to give out some prizes. I'm blind. I can't see. document. All right, so our winner for the copy of Mystery of the Emblem goes to Sarah. Thank you so much for your question. And make sure, if you have the time, make sure your boyfriend checks out the Fire Emblem Sacred Stone speedrun from Games Done Quick, because it's fantastic, and they get into all the technical stuff about the game's programming and all that. So, thank you so much. All right, so you guys are going to come up here on the stage and pick out your characters. So I have 5 of them. So let's go ahead with Garrett, Steve, Emily, Steven, and Jeff. I think that's everybody that asked a question, right? Cool, you guys all get a prize. And you guys can get all these in the artist alley as well. I'm going to give you the person's card. Oh, take this with you. This is their shop, so you can buy more from them. He's so OP. Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. If you guys are interested in Fire Emblem or Fire Emblem cosplay, make sure you get with me the sidebar conversation, because I'm also the basically self-appointed manager of the Fire Emblem Southeast cosplay group. I'd love to chat with you guys.